When it's come to some of these big foreign policy debates here in this country, one of the things I've really enjoyed is that we've got some experts right here in our own backyard that give better insight and better analysis than practically any of the folks you can pull from the East Coast or from the left coast. Like, for example, all this news that's been breaking out about the protests in Iran and everything going on with the terrorist regime in Iran. Look no further than Dr. Mehrdad Kia at the University of Montana. We've had him here on this show, and I tell you what, when it comes to Iran, when it comes to Syria, and that whole region of the world, we can look right here in our own backyard. We can look to folks like Dr. Mehrdad Kia. The other great thing is we've got great military experts right here in our own backyard that we get a chance to catch up with here as well. Here's what I've been fascinated about when it comes to this whole Syria conversation. First off, you might be thinking, well, Aaron, why are you talking about Syria? That's not even in the news anymore. That was like a month ago we were talking about Syria. Remember how President Trump, the media always has to make it sound like, oh, here we go. There's this apocalyptic scenario that the media always tries to portray here. But what I found fascinating about this whole Syria debate is that all of a sudden it seemed like the folks who were anti-war before are now in support of forever war now. The same folks who didn't think we should have gone into Syria in the first place are some of the same folks who are now saying we can never leave and we should never leave Syria. I just find that fascinating. Well, we've got a great guest joining us here this morning on Montana Talks, a guy who was actually on the ground in Syria, working with various factions to go after ISIS and to go after the ISIS terrorists very early on. In fact, he was on the ground in Syria saying that we needed to step up our involvement in Syria when a lot of folks were saying we shouldn't be on the ground in Syria. And so what does he think now about President Trump's latest policy moves in the region? Retired Major General Paul Vallely from the Flathead, now with us here on Montana Talks. General, always good to chat with you. Thanks for being with us this morning.
Yes. Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for your kind invitation.
Well, it was, I think I was talking with, we were talking Syria policy, and I got a phone call from Dr. and State Senator Al Olszewski, and we were talking about Syria policy, and he said, I've actually talked with Major General Paul Vallely about that very topic. If I recall right, I was trying to think back on a conversation that you and I had a few years ago involving Syria, involving Russia. But before we get into that, take us back to when you first got on the ground in Syria here in recent years to try to stand up some rebel groups to go after ISIS.
Well, at the time, Aaron, it was 2012. I was asked to go into the Middle East by a group of people operating out of Turkey and in the war zone around Aleppo, what we call eastern Syria. And that was the Free Syrian Army, which was initiated in the latter part of 2011 to Assad in Damascus and his government because of the tyrannical government that existed in Syria. So I conducted two covert intelligence operations in 2012 and 2013. One was an intel mission into Aleppo at that time, which was the most dangerous city in the world, 100 men. And from that, we were able to come out and request humanitarian aid because Assad was bombing his own people, his own cities. And while I was there, for example, they had just in the past 3 weeks, 70 children with amputation anesthesia. So it was a terrible thing. So we were trying to garner up humanitarian aid and support the Free Syrian Army. Now, that's before ISIS was even on the scene. They weren't even there then.
Interesting.
They
Okay.
had some Al-Qaeda, we passed some Al-Qaeda checkpoints, and there were about 3 or 4 other groups, basically trying to bring down Assad at that time. And we operated out of a base in Hatay province, Hatay, Antakya. and that's where we launched our operation. So I came back, and I made a and to the President Obama at that time, but they would do nothing to support the Syrian people, absolutely nothing. And so as we see, millions, several million now have left Syria. 2012, the refugees that are in Jordan, gone up through, of course, into Europe, and created a tremendous refugee problem, and that still exists today. And then ISIS came about basically 2014 in that area, when Baghdadi launched it at a mosque in a town in Syria. And so that then set off to basically the Grand Caliphate, and to control all that area from Syria on down to North Africa was the plan of ISIS and Baghdadi. Of course, Baghdadi's gone to Allah now. He's not around.
That's right. He's been dealt with.
So, but anyhow, we have plenty of joint forces in the Mediterranean. Our fleet's in the Persian Gulf now. We have an aircraft carrier group. We have the fleet forces in the Mediterranean. We have still a number of special ops, Marines, intel operating out of Iraq and Jordan. We have our air base at Incirlik in Turkey. So we have plenty of forces to support the Kurds. But the president is dedicated. I back him all the way. It's their battle over there.
Well, that's right.
I don't want to see one more casket coming back, with an American body on it in a war that's really not ours.
General, first off, tell us, how do you think President Trump is handling foreign policy with regard to Syria right now?
He's more of a brilliant strategist than a lot of people give the president credit for. I have provided him a plan on Syria. I also provided the president a plan on border control operations on our southern border. So I've been involved in trying forth a new strategy for war fighting, which is one that does not get us engaged in these long-standing wars. It's called the lily pad strategy. So I've given that to President Trump as well. But basically, that means that if we identify through intelligence a target, for example, in Syria, it's against Saddam. We can hit any target 24 hours a day anywhere in the world with our joint forces launching from the lily pads that we have. So in regards to what the president has done, he's moved some of the forces back into Iraq. He's put forces down to guard the oil fields in eastern Syria. So we have a presence there, and we continue to support the Kurds. A lot of people don't know, Aaron, there are 4 Kurdish populations. Southern Turkey has a large population. Then you have the Syrian Kurds, which is the YKP and all that, which were more communist-oriented organizations, which Erdogan, president of Turkey, was really fighting against because they've had a feud going on for several years. Then you have Kurdistan, northern Iraq. You also have Kurds in northern Iran.
Yeah, and so the bigger picture idea was
Kurds in Syria.
Yeah, and I know, a lot of people in the right after the news out of Syria, they said, "Oh, President Trump's abandoning the Kurds, and he's retreating from the ISIS fight." Well, that clearly is not taking place. It was one of my more liberal friends on Twitter on the Montana Politics hashtag, and he shared this news story, and it was from Northern Syria, and he was outraged. He was outraged by the fact that there was a Russian flag on this base in Northern Syria, and I guess because he would rather that there was an American flag planted on the ground in Northern Syria. And he was outraged by it, and he thought that picture was a depiction of American failure in northern Syria because of Trump's foreign policy. And I just looked at that, and I scratched my head, and I said, wait a minute, this is the same guy who would have been bashing George W. Bush because of whatever war we were in. And this is a guy who would have been anti-war a few years ago, but now that Donald Trump is pulling some American forces out of northern Syria, all of a sudden he's the forever war war guy on Twitter here, and some of our more liberal friends who would have been anti-war are now saying, no, we need to stay there forever in places like Northern Syria. But also, when I looked at that picture, I thought back to a conversation that I had. I think I was in the Flathead, and I ran into retired Major General Paul Vallely. And he talked about a trip that he made to Moscow where he sat down with the Europeans and with the Russians, focused on Syria. And then he kind of told me what his theory was, what his strategy was, what that he would suggest when it comes to Northern Syria. And I thought, wow, that is exactly what is playing out right now. I mean, it's like General Vallely basically predicted this situation here. And anyway, General Paul Vallely now joining us from the Flathead here on Montana Talks. General, I think I ran into you shortly after President Trump's election, and you were saying, hey, here's what we got to do on Syria. And do I recall correctly, you basically said, look, what we need to do, we need to get the Russians bogged down in Syria in dealing with that situation over there. And they can spend their money and bankrupt themselves getting over involved in that area. But what we don't need to be is ourselves bogged down and bankrupting America, getting bogged down over in that neck of the woods. Is that a good summary of the conversation we probably had a couple years ago?
Yes, it is. And, I'll go back to unnecessary wars. Iraq was an unnecessary war. Yes, they had some chemical weapon people, but they really were not a direct threat to the United States. And so I thought it was a big mistake to go into Iraq, and we should have ended Afghanistan after 3 months there where we knocked out with 100 men the Taliban. Should have turned it over to the Afghans at that time. But anyhow, that's hindsight. What we know when I met with the Russians, Syria's been a client state of Russia for decades. And so the Russians wanted to control an oil pipeline from eastern northern Syria across Syria into the Mediterranean. So the Russians set up a big port in Tartus on the coast there in the Mediterranean, just north of Lebanon. And they also established a very large airfield north of that in Latakia, and where they've operated from. And they were very, very instrumental in defeating ISIS up in that area, too, as we were. So we were both fighting in areas in northeast Syria to knock out ISIS. So the Russians work with Erdogan in Turkey. Erdogan sort of plays the middle part between the United States and Turkey. But Aaron, let me just emphasize, we tend to always look through our eyes in solving these problems. But you have to put yourself in, and look through the eyes of the Russians and the Turks, the Kurds, and what they're doing. When you look back, you come up with a whole different outlook on the situation. Unfortunately, I've been able to do that, as I did in Egypt as well with General al-Sisi. So this whole thing in Syria now, the oil fields we're guarding, I would say that Assad's going to continue in power there and be supported by the Russians, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, unless Assad leaves early.
Well, and I remember, because I think there were even, there were a lot of Trump supporters who got nervous when he announced this withdrawal of really a very small number of U.S. forces that were in this particular part of northern Syria. And even some of Trump's strongest supporters were nervous when that was happening. But I remember it's like, okay, when I'm seeing this mainstream media narrative, whenever they start running with their apocalyptic predictions and it's all Donald Trump's fault and the world's going to end, I get skeptical. And so I wasn't buying any of this anti-Trump nonsense with regard to his policy in Syria. But you could reach out to people like Dr. Kia at the University of Montana. You could read, James J. Carafano at the Heritage Foundation, who was saying, wait a minute, don't buy what you're seeing in the mainstream media right now. And the mainstream media was predicting, we're retreating from the ISIS fight and the Kurds are going to get annihilated here. Whereas level heads were saying quite the opposite.
Yeah, none of that happened, did it?
Yeah.
None of those forecasts happened. That's because they didn't understand the situation on the ground and what was happening over there. So, again, these ever-ending, these wars don't end. It's like Vietnam that went on and on and on. And that was another unnecessary war, in my opinion, as well. And I served 2 tours in Vietnam.
And thanks to you and all the Vietnam veterans, by the way, too.
Yeah. But we have to look at today and tomorrow, and we have to really look at threats to the United States. And our biggest threat now is the cartels south of our southern border. They're located in about 6 or 7 different territories. So we're working on an offensive plan for President Trump to do covert operations along with the Mexicans, if they'll agree, and neutralize and take out the cartels once and for all. So we're working on a plan on that right now.
Well, and we know the cartels are operating here in Montana. We've heard that from state, local, and federal law enforcement officials. The Crow tribal leaders just said earlier this week at a meeting in Lodge Grass that they know that they had an explosion in violence on the reservation, and they know that the cartels are operating there. So this isn't just a southern border problem.
Yep, that's right. No, we have some coming in. They doubled crossings from Canada into the United States last year, but that was mostly up in the northeast section of the United States and that part of eastern Canada, not so much in the west, but there's been a little dribbling coming down. But that's why we have to focus on what are our real threats and get out of the Middle East, let them solve their own problems over there. We'll stand by to support whatever friends and allies we think deserve that support, like the Kurds, and we'll be there for them. We're not withdrawing. As I said, we have plenty of forces in the Middle East to do anything we want to do, if necessary, to support our friends there.
And now other nations have stepped forward to also ensure that the Kurds are protected in that region, and now we don't have a small number of American forces basically caught up in the middle of a geopolitical quagmire, and this was all thanks to President Trump's efforts. And yeah, that's why some people, they might be saying, well, why are you talking about Syria today? That's not really news anymore. Well, it's not really news anymore because the mainstream media, the news, got it so wrong with their anti-Trump narrative. And yeah, same thing with the border, right?
Yeah, they had to go to the Ukraine, right? They had to move out of that and go to the Ukraine myth. Yeah.
That's right.
Boy.
What do you think about this impeachment inquiry, this whole circus, by the way?
Well, you hit the word. Circus is actually a 3-ring circus, and it's just a continuation from the Russian myth. It's been carried forward to the Ukraine now, and the Democrats, I think, are starting to understand that this was all a contrived effort to bring the president down. And certainly the Republicans are getting stronger now and supporting the president. But, our Congress is so ineffective now. It's just, I think, for most Americans, they can't understand why Congress can't get anything done, and they're using all the time and energy on these investigations of the president. So it's very frustrating right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Well, and there was a piece in the Washington Post by Rachel Bade that some Democrats are now, quote, getting cold feet and raising questions about whether Nancy Pelosi could lose more Democrats. Not only are they taking heat for this impeachment, it's suffering miserably in the polling among independents, and even Democrats are now kind of turning on this impeachment process. But what's I think is also worrying some of the congressional Democrats is if they actually move forward with the impeachment charges, well, then it goes to the Senate. Well, now the Republicans can call witnesses, including the Bidens.
Right.
That's got to have them nervous.
Yep. Well, the other story I didn't really want to talk about is our Navy SEAL Gallagher that was just pardoned by the president and all that huff.
Yeah.
With the Secretary of the Navy finally being fired last week, and I guess earlier this week. I think it was probably on Monday. But we've had all these politicized flag officers, generals, and admirals that were appointed under Obama. And they were more interested in following the judge advocates, the lawyers in the Navy and Army and Air Force with their recommendations rather than taking care of our troops as they should. And, Gallagher, the court-martial, was found not guilty.
Yeah.
Not guilty. But they tried to get him because they caught him at a picture standing next to a dead body. That's why they were going to take his trident seal away from him. And the president finally stepped in and said, quit abusing Gallagher and his family. They've been through enough. and I applaud the president for doing that. But some of these people in the Pentagon are part of the deep state as well, and you can see by some of their actions just on the Gallagher issue what they do and can do, and the swamp is not completely cleaned up yet.
Yeah, there's a lot more draining that needs to be done. That is for sure. We're talking with retired Major General Paul Vallely, lives in the Flathead Valley of Montana. Always great to get his insight on these issues and more. Well, he was a senior military analyst for the Fox News Channel from 2000 to 2007, retired after a 32-year career with the U.S. Army, retired. In fact, in 1991, he retired from the U.S. Army as Deputy Commanding General of the U.S. Army Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii. But most importantly, he's one of our great Vietnam veterans. General Paul Vallely here with us from the Flathead Valley, live on Montana Talks this morning. Taking your phone calls as well, 406-294-0970. First up, let's go to Mike in Kalispell, listening to KJJR. Mike, did you have a question or comment for General Vallely?
Hey, General Vallely, this is Mike Abear. You and I have been friends for a while, but there's something I really appreciate.
Mike.
Hey, how you doing? I really appreciate how you have a heart for the enlisted, and this Navy SEAL. Just think about what a bunch of garbage that they put this guy through,
Yeah.
Yeah, and then tried to pile on after that. Yeah, go ahead, General.
I was just going to say, Mike, did you want to ask a specific question, or can we talk about that?
Well, I'll just say something, and I'll let you talk about it, because I really respect you, and you've done a lot of great stuff, not just for our country, but afterwards for us veterans. And is that here's a Navy SEAL. I mean, think about it. And you've all watched the movies, you all read the books, what they have to go through. The selection course, the requirements they have to meet just to be on the teams. And here's a guy at the highest level in the Navy SEAL. How many dead bodies has this guy walked through or crawled through? How many dead bodies of his own men has he had to carry out over his back? And here they photograph him next to a dead body. Oh, my gosh, this is a guy that they have trained, hired, and that we honor for piling up dead bodies of bad guys. And now they're going to, that's why I just wanted to say this is more than obscenely ridiculous. This is Orwellian at the worst.
All right, Mike, thanks for your call.
Yeah. Well, Mike and Aaron, it goes back to Vietnam on the rules of engagement that are established in an operational war zone to guide our troops of things they should do or not do. And so even back in Vietnam, when we were bombing targets, tertiary targets that had basically no value, and those rules of engagement came right from the White House. So over a period of time, the judge advocates, the lawyers, start getting involved in these rules of engagements to an extreme degree, prohibiting a lot of our troops in the field from executing their mission. For example, one of the orders went out in Afghanistan, you can't shoot back unless they shoot at you type of thing. I mean, these were ridiculous things. So we put our men and women under these adverse effects, very threatening, very high risk, and yet the chain of command in some areas will not support him, in case of Gallagher, and 8 others, by the way. So it's a travesty, and that's why we got to clean up the deep state and these Obama-appointed flag officers and have them retire early. Put some new warriors in there.
All right, we'll stick some more phone calls in here as we chat with General Vallely, 406-294-0970. Next up, let's go to Daniel in Bozeman, listening to 1450 KMMS. Daniel, did you have a quick question or comment for General Vallely?
Well, I have a bumper sticker on my car that says terrorists are what the big army calls the little army, not to mention Syria and Turkey calling each other the aggressor. I would call this huge army of the USA walking into nations and calling them the aggressor quite bizarre. If the USA walks into nations, the young boys that saw that in the past are now young men, and they'll fight the USA tooth and nail. The old saying is perception is reality. We should be finessing a consciousness struggle, not just surface from how strong we are.
All right, so Daniel basically saying, well, it's the U.S. that's the aggressor here. General Vallely, your thoughts?
Well, again, it goes back to how we operate at the national security level and what the guidance is done or provided for by the national security staff and the State Department as well as the Department of Defense to identify external threats to the United States. And so that we have not been really analyzing them over the past decades to the degree we need to. And so we've done cross-border operations in Syria, in Iraq, Afghanistan, even in South America to some degree. We have to be very careful in the future not to repeat these kinds of unnecessary wars and involvements. They've got to be examined very carefully. And if they are a direct threat to us, or our troops overseas, or the civilians overseas, or U.S. corporations that threaten the United States and what we do, then we've got to look at that threat and we've got to neutralize it. But we certainly don't have to invade these countries in these big, long-lasting wars anymore.
Well, and you mentioned our southern border. You mentioned our southern border in particular earlier, and how, look, we do have a clear threat on our southern border right now, and you talked about putting together. What can you tell us about kind of your game plan? What's your war plan to tackle this problem with the Mexican drug cartels and the meth that we know is causing so many of these problems right here in Montana?
Well, the first plan that we sent President Trump was to put active forces on the border to augment the National Guard, drug enforcement officers down there, the border control and units along our borders down there, and provide better intelligence, aerial support, satellite support, so we can watch and see what's going on as they come up from Central and South America and what I call illegal border crossers. But the main threat, again, is the cartels and the billions of dollars of drugs that are coming into the country now, fentanyl, meth. So that's bad. But human trafficking, sex trafficking, all these things the cartels are involved in. So my plan is that we need to go on offense. We can't win the border war by just playing defense. So we need to work with the Mexican Marines. Many of the political leaders in Mexico are afraid to do anything because some of them even get paid some money by the cartels. So they get influenced, but they're afraid for their lives. So basically, I'd have the president go down to Mexico City, bring in the president of Guatemala, Honduras, and sit down and basically say, okay, we have all these things going on that affect and threaten the United States on our southern border, and it's costing us a lot of assets to do that, building the wall, for example, which is necessary. But I would basically do covert operations using predators and our joint forces stationed, for example, in Fort Huachuca or Camp Pendleton in California or Fort Hood, Texas. And I would run some command and control operation centers out there and target and eliminate the cartels.
Well, yeah, and of course, one question is, how do we do that without the support of Mexico's president? Because I think, when that family was brutally targeted and women and children were murdered down in Mexico by the cartels in wide open daylight, the Mexican president responded by saying he's going to further his hugs, not bullets strategy. It's just absurd. Yeah. Anyway, we'll talk more about that with General Vallely, but want to get to more phone calls here as well. Skip in the Bitterroot. Do you have a quick question or comment for General Vallely?
Yes, sir. Thank you. And General, thank you sincerely from, I'm sure, hundreds of people that are listening for your service to our country. I would like to know if you can tell us, presently during this Thanksgiving and upcoming Christmas season, are there any units from Montana that are presently deployed in those delicate areas that you've been discussing, Syria and that part of the country, that we should be thinking of this Christmas season? I figured you might know who they are or where they're from, so that we can, as Montanans, be praying for them thanking them for keeping us safe.
All right. Thanks, Skip. Thanks for that question. Yeah, General, your thoughts?
Thank you.
Well, I think, of course, we've had continually National Guard units from Montana going on these missions into the Middle East, particularly Afghanistan. I think we may have a unit still over in Afghanistan, but I'm not sure if they've rotated back. We have some of our National Guard men. I just met two last week, or whenever Veterans Day was, and they're on their way to Kuwait, for example. And Kuwait has a very big base there, which supports operations in Iraq and Syria and so forth. So, yes, we do have Montanans over there, not in big numbers anymore, but certainly units that augment the active forces in those combat areas.
Yeah, I know the Montana Air National Guard, their crews recently got back from overseas, and the Montana Army National Guard, the 189th Aviation Battalion, they're at their pre-deployment training, as I understand it still. In fact, during the Cat Grizz football game last Saturday, it was kind of cool seeing some of the pictures. It looked like they were in the hangar with the helicopters and everything, and they got a chance to watch the game and have a little barbecue or so. So nice to see they got a little break to catch the Cat Grizz game last weekend. But then, of course, there's all sorts of active duty soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, Coast Guard, service members, and more. And I will guarantee you that if there's an American footprint anywhere in the world, I will guarantee you there's probably a Montanan who's a part of it. That's the deal. There's so many Montanans that step up and serve, and it's a great thing to be thankful for this Thanksgiving. That's for sure. Next up on the phone lines, let's go to Ed in Whitefish, listening to KJJR. Ed, did you have a quick question or comment for General Vallely?
Yes. Good morning, gentlemen. Hey, as a result of sanctions that the Trump administration placed on Iran, the Iranian government recently raised energy prices, which has resulted in civil insurrection with over 59 state banks being burned to the ground. Do you think the United States has an opportunity that the previous administration squandered during the last time the Iranian people rebelled against the theocracy?
All right, good question. Let's throw that to General Paul Vallely. General, your thoughts?
Well, what we have now is a new organization. I shouldn't say new. It's been developing called Cyrus Force Iran, and that is a coalition of opposition groups inside and outside Iran, which are providing the basis, or at least the platform, for a government in exile when the mullahs fail. The sanctions have been very hard, of course, on Iran, but the protests have been going on just in the last 30 days. Over 300 people have been killed just in the last month over in Iran. So the situation there is very bad. I don't see the mullahs lasting much more than another year or two. But good to know that they have a coalition of these different groups coming together and being funded by certain countries, and basically sending in medicine, humanitarian type of aid right now. So that's what's happening.
Is it almost too optimistic to ever envision regime change anytime soon in Iran? I know these protests have taken over the country, and getting the readouts from Dr. Mehrdad Kia from the University of Montana, for example. I mean, he was doing some translation on these protests, and one of their criticisms is they feel that the Iranian government is overextending its influence too much, basically in these forever wars across their region. That's the criticism of the people there, which is kind of interesting.
Well, it is. I mean, they're spending, I don't know how many millions of dollars each and every year to support Hamas and Hezbollah, and that money is not going in to support the people in Iran, a very impoverished nation throughout Iran, and what we have basically down in the Awazi area, which is on the Iraqi border, that's where all the oil comes. And they don't; those people down there don't participate much in the oil revenues because it all goes to the regime. So that's a very, very big problem. But watch Cyrus Force Iran. It's becoming a very viable outside source to support the Iranian people.
Interesting. We've only got a couple of minutes left here. I think we can sneak in at least one more phone call here with General Vallely. Next up, we got a caller, Mike, on the line. Looks like he's listening all the way from Arkansas. Mike, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, sir. Thank you, General. We appreciate your service. Question that I had for you is, my wife and I, watching current events, things that are happening, we hear the deep state, all that, but we believe that we're in an intelligence coup. Is your thoughts on that, please?
All right, thanks, Mike.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it was generated by Brennan at the CIA and senior members in the FBI, along with some direction coming right from the White House from Obama, formerly in the White House, I should say, but he's still active and was active right from the beginning to get involved with this, helping organize the collusion with Secretary Brennan at the time, the head of the CIA. So that's what's happening, and we have to be aware that that this silent coup has been going on for 3 years, and hopefully it can come to an end so we can get back to doing the real business for our people.
Amen to that. Well, General Vallely, it's been such a great pleasure to have you on the show this morning. Thanks for taking time with us for the full hour. 30 seconds to go or so here. How can folks follow you to see, to get some of your insights on foreign policy or anything like that?
Well, you can Google. We have 280,000 hits on Google that you can see all our articles if you'd like to, or go to our website, which is standupamericaus.org, standupamericaus.org, or you can email us at standupamericausa1@gmail.com.
All right, General Paul Vallely, again, great to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us.